Fantastic. Okay, well, hi everyone, and nice to meet you. And thanks for taking the time to come today. As James says, my name is Mike Coxhead. I'm currently a lecturer in ancient philosophy at King's, and I'm going to be talking today about the criticism of democracy in Plato's Republic. I guess some of which you're going to be familiar with from the classical civilization syllabus. So my aim today is kind of threefold. I want to help you understand the critique of democracy that we get in Plato's Republic. And there we'll be covering the stuff that you've done in the syllabus, but also going a little bit beyond it as well. I also want to put Plato into dialogue with Pericles, and particularly Pericles' funeral oration that you've probably read bits of from Thucydides, or maybe all of it. And what I want to do all the way, because I think this is the best way to learn ancient philosophy, ancient Greek philosophy, is I want us to think about the kind of core philosophical problems that are at the heart of the disagreement here. So that's what we're going to try and do. Okay, so to get started, I want to start thinking precisely about the philosophical problem at the heart, I think, of something like the Republic, or at least one of the philosophical problems at the heart of the Republic. And it goes a bit like this. Suppose that we are going to have a government. I know, of course, that we already have a government, right? But imagine we don't have one, and we've decided that we want to have a government. If we're going to have a government, we've got some questions to answer, right? First of all, what kind of government should we have? How should decisions be made, for example, about laws and policies? And perhaps most importantly, who should rule? Who should be put in charge and have authority over us? Well, fortunately, right, we've got lots of different options to choose from. We could choose to have a democracy that is roughly ruled by the people, the demos. But we don't have to choose a democracy, right? We could choose to have an oligarchy that's ruled by the few. So we might decide to have the wealthy in charge, or maybe the nobility, or maybe even some experts. We could leave some experts to run the country. We could choose this. And we could also choose, right, to have an autocracy that is ruled by just one person. So we might choose to have an absolute monarch, or even we could choose to have a dictator. Might be a strange choice, but it's at least an option we've got. Now you might think, well, okay, it's obvious, right? We're obviously going to choose democracy. It's the best of all forms of government. So let's just suppose, for sake of argument, that we do choose democracy. Nonetheless, right, if we're going to be doing some philosophy, we've still got some questions to answer. Primarily, what justifies this choice? What makes it the right choice? And why choose democracy over other forms of government? Now, this is obviously something that was debated at length in ancient Greece. And to be honest, it's still something that's debated now by contemporary political philosophers. And it's actually surprisingly difficult to pinpoint why exactly democracy is the right kind of government compared with other ones. That's a debate that still rages on. But anyway, right, let's suppose that we do choose democracy, and we want to answer this question: why choose democracy over other forms of government? Well, fortunately, being good students of classical civilization, we've read Thucydides, we've read the funeral oration given by Pericles in Thucydides' histories. And in the funeral oration, right, Pericles lists a bunch of different democratic values. So these might help us answer our question of why choose democracy. I'm going to briefly mention three of them here. Of course, he mentions more, but these are three which I think are fairly important. One value of democracy is equality in both political participation and equality before the law. Here's what Pericles says about it. It's true that our government is called a democracy because its administration is in the hands not of the few, but of the many. And as regards the law, all men are on an equality for the settlement of their private disputes. So what's the idea here? Well, look, in democracies, we treat people as equals, both before the law, but also in political participation. Everyone can take part in democracy, be it at the assembly or in the council, or at least all citizens, or as a juror, for example. So there's equality in democracy. And that's one reason we should pick democracy, we might say. Another value of democracy, according to Pericles in the funeral oration, is what we might say liberality and freedom. Here's what he says. Not only in our public life are we liberal, but also as regards our freedom from suspicion of one another in the pursuits of everyday life. For we do not feel resentment at our neighbour if he does as he likes, nor yet do we put on sour looks, which, though harmless, are painful to behold. So what's he saying here? Well, he's saying, look, in democracies, we're liberal, right? We let people live whatever kind of life they like. And, you know, even if we don't really approve of it, we're not going to disapprove, right? We're not going to tell them what life they should lead. So we're liberal, and people can live whatever kind of life they like in a democracy. So there's also freedom. Great. Okay, so that's two kind of thumbs up for democracy so far. Here's a third, what I'm calling collective deliberation. Here's what Pericles says. He says, we Athenians decide public questions for ourselves in the belief that it is not debate that is a hindrance to action, but rather not to be instructed by debate before the time comes for action. That's a hindrance. For in truth, we have this point also of superiority over other men to be most daring in action, and yet at the same time, most given to reflection upon the ventures we mean to undertake. Well, what's he saying here? Well, I think the basic idea, right, is in democracies, if we need to make a decision about whether to go to war, about policies or law, well, we decide collectively, and doing it collectively, we debate the issue, right? And in debating the issue, we're probably going to make a better informed decision. So this is the value of collective deliberation in democracy. So back to our question, right? Why choose democracy over other forms of government? Well, here's how Pericles might have answered. He might say, well, that's easy to answer. In democracies, everyone comes together to debate and deliberate about what to do. So democracies will make the best decisions. That's one thing. But not only that, democracy also ensures political equality. All citizens get to participate in government, and they are all treated as equals before the law. And not only that, democracies are also liberal, allowing everyone the freedom to live whatever life they want. So democracy is the obvious choice. So that's a perspective from Pericles' funeral oration in Thucydides. There are, of course, other values he lists there, but here are three which I think are interesting to kind of think about when we're going to eventually talk about Plato. And indeed, what I'd like to do is now to contrast this kind of picture of democracy with the ideal city in Plato's Republic. So what I'm going to do now is give you a kind of brief overview of that ideal city before looking at the specific criticisms of democracy. So as you may know, in the ideal city in the Republic, there are three classes of citizen. So there are rulers, sometimes called complete guardians, who are the philosophers. The philosophers are in charge, politically speaking, in the ideal city. The second class of citizen are the auxiliaries, or the auxiliary guardians, who are essentially a professional army who defend the city in wars and police the city. Then third and finally, there are the money makers. So these are people like farmers, cobblers, merchants, doctors, so on and so forth. People who practice crafts and make money in the city. So there are three classes of citizen. Now, one striking feature in comparison to democracies, right, is that in Plato's ideal city, political decisions are not made democratically by the people, like in assemblies or in the council, for example, right? Instead, there is a strict division of labor between each class of citizen. That means that the money makers and the auxiliary guardians have no role to play in ruling, okay? All political decisions are made by the philosopher rulers and the philosopher rulers alone. So far, not very democratic, right? We don't make decisions democratically, political decisions democratically in the ideal city. But not only that, right? It looks like the ideal city runs up against the idea of freedom, right? That Pericles thinks is a value of democracy. In the ideal city, people are not free to live whatever life they want. And a point that's often brought up here is the so-called principle of specialization, which is something that is referred to throughout the Republic. According to this principle, each person is to do that task and only that task to which they are most naturally suited. So if you're most naturally suited to ruling, you're going to rule and nothing else. If you're most naturally suited to being a warrior, you're going to be a warrior. You're not going to be a ruler. You're not going to be a moneymaker. And if you're most naturally suited to being a farmer, well, that's your lot, mate. You're going to be a farmer in the ideal city. You won't be able to be a ruler or a warrior. So people are not free to live whatever kind of life they want. And we also have the so-called noble lie. This is a kind of myth or a lie told to the citizens in the ideal city. The citizens are told that each of them is born with a different metal type. So some are born to be gold people, and these people are going to be the rulers. Some are born silver, and they're going to be part of the army. And some are born iron or bronze, and these are going to be the money makers. So people aren't free to live whatever life they want, and it also doesn't sound very egalitarian here, I would say. So Plato's ideal city, right, is starkly undemocratic compared to compared to Athenian democracy, but also compared in particular to the values of democracy as described by Pericles, right? So the ideal city is starkly anti-democratic. Now, this has some implications for democracy, right? In the Republic, the ideal city is meant to be the good city, the just city. It's the ideal city, right? Once described as the Kallipolis, the fine city. Now, that has a very obvious implication. If Plato's ideal city is ideal, it means that any other city is going to be non-ideal. It's going to be not good and not just. So since democratic cities, for example, democratic Athens, is not the ideal city, it follows that democratic Athens, on Plato's view, is not good. It is not just. So it seems, right, Plato's going to have some kind of negative views on democracy. Now, we can see this in particular if we have a look or think about Plato's definition of justice in the ideal city. I'm not sure whether that is on your syllabus, but I'll very briefly describe it so you know what I'm talking about. In the Republic, we have a definition of justice in the city, and it's quite a strange definition. Justice in the city is each class of citizen doing the job to which they are naturally suited. So in a just city, right, the rulers rule, the army guard, and the money makers make money, according to the principle of specialization mentioned earlier. So in a just city, each class of citizen or each type of person does the job to which they're suited and doesn't do anything else. Now, notably, right, this does not happen in democracies, or at least in democracies as they existed in ancient Greece. So think about democratic Athens, for example, right? If you were a citizen in democratic Athens, you can be a moneymaker. Maybe you're a potter, for example. But you will also do other jobs in the city, right? You will also rule, right? You might take part in the assembly. You might be a member of the council. You might be a juror, so on and so forth. And you might even fight in wars on behalf of Athens, right? So in democratic cities, people don't stick to the job to which they're most naturally suited. And according to Plato, a city in which this happens, in which people don't do the jobs to which they're most naturally suited, or only those jobs, this city is unjust, according to Plato. So on Plato's view, democratic cities, because citizens will do a wide range of jobs, not only, for example, making money, but also ruling and fighting in the army potentially as well, such a city is unjust. Okay. So far, going back to our question, why choose democracy over other forms of government, we have two views on the table. We have Pericles, who thinks, well, obviously you should choose democracy over other forms, because democracy is great, right? In democracy, we have good decisions being made when we deliberate. We have equality, and we have liberty for all. Hooray! On the other hand, we have Plato, who is going to say, don't choose democracy, right? democracies are unjust according to the definition of justice we just heard. And he's going to say, don't choose democracy, pick my ideal city instead. Or at least that's what he might say. Okay, so far, right, we've got a clash of values. On the one hand, Pericles is saying, pick democracy, good decisions, equality, and liberty. And on the other hand, Plato's saying, pick my ideal city over democracy, because my ideal city is just. So we have these different political values, liberty, equality, good decisions on the one hand, and justice on the other. But as you may well know, Plato will also tackle each of Pericles' democratic values head on. So he will argue that in a democracy, you don't get good decisions being made. And he will also argue that in a democracy, the so-called equality and liberty that democracies have aren't actually good things. And this is what I want to cover in the rest of this talk. I'll first talk about why Plato thinks democracy doesn't make good decisions. I'll then talk about why he thinks equality and liberty in democracies, actually, they aren't good things. Okay, so let's start off with the first point. Do democracies make good decisions or not? Now, as I said, Plato's going to say, no, they don't. So what I want to do now is go over why he thinks that, and then think about how Pericles might try and respond to Plato's criticisms. Okay, so why doesn't Plato think that democracies make good decisions? Well, as you'll remember, right, in the ideal city, the rulers are philosophers. Here's how it's put by Socrates. Until philosophers rule as kings, that is, until political power and philosophy entirely coincide, cities will have no rest from evils, nor, I think, will the human race. So, philosophers will rule in the ideal city. But you might be thinking, why should philosophers be rulers? I mean, aren't philosophers actually just a bit useless? Now, I think three basic ideas drive this thought. I think there are actually more than three in the Republic driving it, but here are three basic ideas that drive this thought that philosophers should be rulers. And this will help us see why Plato thinks democracies will make bad decisions. So the first idea is that there are objective moral truths, okay? Now, Plato thinks about these objective moral truths in terms of the forms, right? You'll have heard of the forms, for example, the form of justice, the form of beauty, the form of the good. Now, what are each of these things? Well, the form of justice, for example, is the true nature of justice, what justice really is. So in Plato's view, there are objective moral truths, the forms, for example, the form of justice, the true nature of justice. So that's the first idea. The second idea is that only philosophers have knowledge of these objective moral truths. So in the Republic, philosophers are by definition people who know the form of justice, the form of beauty, the form of good, so on and so forth. And I say by definition because that's all it means to be a philosopher, or at least part of what it means to be a philosopher. If you know the forms, you are a philosopher. If you don't, you ain't a philosopher. So indeed, everyone who isn't a philosopher lacks this knowledge. People who aren't philosophers and don't know, for example, the form of justice, only recognize shadows of justice, as it's later described in the allegory of the cave. Okay, so 2 points so far. There are objective moral truths, the forms, and only philosophers know those objective moral truths. Then there's a third crucial point. This knowledge of the forms of objective moral truths, this knowledge is required for ruling well. Now, how exactly, because that's a crucial point, right? How is it, because it's going to explain why philosophers should rule. Philosophers should rule because only philosophers have this knowledge, the knowledge that's required for ruling well. How's that idea meant to work? Well, I'm going to illustrate it with an example, a kind of different kind of example, and then bring it back to the question of justice and ruling. In the top right-hand corner of the presentation, there is a painting. It's a Monet painting, and it's an example of Impressionism, right? Impressionism was a style of painting, an artistic movement with this kind of hazy look, often with kind of small, thin brush strokes and so on and so forth. You might know about Impressionism. Now, I want you to imagine that I don't know what Impressionism is, right? I've never heard of Impressionism. I've never seen an Impressionist painting. I don't have the foggiest clue what Impressionism is. Now, I also want you to imagine that I've been set a challenge. My challenge is to make an Impressionist painting. Would I be able to do that? Well, I think the probable answer is no, right? I couldn't make an Impressionist painting because I don't know what Impressionist paintings look like. I've never heard of Impressionism. I've never seen an Impressionist painting. I haven't the foggiest clue about Impressionism. Now, of course, right, I might make a very, very, very lucky guess and just happen by accident to produce a painting that looks like an Impressionist painting. But I'd have to be very, very lucky, right, first. And also, I wouldn't know that what I had made is an Impressionist painting because I don't know what Impressionist paintings look like. It would have just been a lucky guess. So I couldn't reliably make Impressionist paintings, I think. Now, okay, take that example and apply it to justice and the forms. Now imagine that I don't know the form of justice, right? I don't know the true nature of justice. I'm not a philosopher in Plato's sense. Now also imagine that I'm set a challenge again. This time my challenge is to make a just political decision. So for example, maybe I've got to make a new law and the law has to be a just law. Could I do this? Well, again, I think the answer is no, right? I don't know what justice is. I don't know the true nature of justice. And if I don't know the true nature of justice, how could I know what a just law is? I couldn't make a just law. Just like I couldn't make an Impressionist painting if I don't know what Impressionism is. So of course, again, maybe I could make a very, very lucky guess and just happen by luck, pure chance to get it right and make a just law. But again, I'd have to be extremely lucky, right? And I wouldn't know that what I had made is a just law because I don't know the true nature of justice. So I couldn't reliably make just laws or just political decisions. Now we just take the reasoning a bit further, right? If I can't reliably make just laws because I don't know the true nature of justice, then I probably shouldn't be a ruler making political decisions, right? On the assumption that rulers ought to be able to make just decisions. Now, I'm hoping that this will help us see better the importance of knowledge for ruling in the Republic. Here's what Plato might say. Look, our political leaders, our rulers, they need to be able to make decisions that are good and just. But it's impossible to do this without knowing the true nature of justice or of goodness, for example. That's to say, it's impossible to do this without knowing the forms. Fortunately, however, there are some people who have this knowledge, the philosophers. So philosophers should rule. I think that's the basic nub of the argument. Now, this line of thought is also illustrated further with the images of the ship and the beast, which I believe you know from your syllabus, and I'll discuss very briefly now, because they capture not only the knowledge of the philosopher, but also the ignorance of the people in a democracy. So in the image of the ship, the city of Athens, presumably of democratic Athens, that is not actually specific in the text, but it's thought that the ship is meant to be analogous to the city of Athens. So the ship is compared to democratic Athens, okay? So on the ship, there are three characters corresponding to three types of people in democratic Athens. First of all, there's the ship owner, who obviously owns the ship, but is a bit short-sighted, hard of hearing, and ignorant of the craft of seafaring. They don't know how to sail, they don't know how to navigate. They just happen to own the ship. Then there are the sailors. Now, the sailors actually are also ignorant of seafaring. They don't know how to sail the ship, and they don't know how to navigate. But they are able to take control of the ship by persuading and even drugging the ship owner. Then third and finally, there is the so-called true captain or true navigator. This person knows the craft of seafaring, so they know how to successfully steer and navigate the ship. But they are ignored by the ship owner and even ridiculed by the sailors. Now, these three people on the ship are meant to correspond to three types of people in democratic Athens. First of all, there is the people, the demos, who are meant to correspond to the ship owner. The people own the city, right? They hold political power, and that's why they own the city, because the decisions are ultimately made by them in the assembly or the council. But they are ignorant of the craft of ruling. They don't know how to rule well because they don't know the forms. Then there are democratic politicians who are meant to be analogous to the sailors. The politicians are also ignorant of the craft of ruling, but they are able to persuade the people to essentially hand control over to them, for example, by giving persuasive speeches in the assembly. And third and finally, there is the philosopher, who's meant to be analogous to the true captain or navigator. The philosopher knows the craft of ruling, they know the forms, so they know how to govern the city well, but they are ignored by the people and ridiculed by democratic politicians. So we have this fairly grim view of democracy, right? And I think the argument's meant to go a bit like this. Imagine you're on a ship, right? If you were trying to decide how to sail the ship, how to navigate it, how to sail it, would you put this to a majority vote? Well, you probably wouldn't, would you, right? Because most people on a ship don't know how to sail. For example, if you're on a cruise ship, right? Most of the people on the ship don't know anything about sailing. They're just passengers. So you wouldn't put it to a majority vote, right? You'd ask instead the person who knows about navigation and seafaring, the specialist. Now, the thought is meant to be the same should apply in the city, right? In a city, why let the ignorant people rule? Why let them make the decisions, right? Wouldn't it be better to ask someone who is an expert in political matters? And that is, Plato thinks, the philosopher. Okay, so that's the image of the ship. Let's also talk briefly about the image of the beast. So in the image of the beast, we have the beast and the tamer on the one hand. The beast is like a wild beast, I guess like a lion or something, they're not really specific, who is strong and powerful, liable to changes in mood, and driven by its appetites, okay? And in addition to the beast, there is a beast tamer, who, I guess like a lion tamer, who rears the beast, learns what the beast likes and what angers it, and uses this kind of information to soothe and manipulate the beast. Now, the beast and the tamer are meant to be analogous to two groups of people in democratic Athens. On the one hand, the beast is meant to be analogous to the people, right? So the thought is that the people, the demos, are strong and powerful because political decisions are ultimately up to them in the assembly, for example, or in the council. But they're also liable to changing their minds quickly and easily. They're driven by their appetites. They have certain things they like or dislike. So maybe they like freedom, maybe they dislike corruption. But ultimately, they are ignorant, right? They're like a beast, a wild beast. Wild beasts are not intelligent. They're non-rational beings. So similarly, we're meant to think, I believe, that the people are like that, non-rational beings, driven by their appetites. Then in addition to the people, there are the sophists who are meant to be like the tamer of the beast. The sophists have tamed and acquired a knack for handling the people, right? So the sophists have learned to like read the mood of the people, and they've learned what the people like or dislike, and they soothe and manipulate the crowd with speeches, calling whatever the people like just, and whatever the people happen to dislike unjust. But just like the people, the sophists are ignorant of what is in fact good, bad, right and wrong, just and unjust. So again, right, we have a fairly grim picture of democracy. The ignorant people on the one hand, driven by their appetites and lacking knowledge, and also the ignorant sophists and politicians on the other. So let's now think, with all this information in mind, let's think how Plato might respond to democracy, to Pericles' thought that democracy is good because democracies make good decisions. So Pericles says we should choose democracy because democracies make good decisions. And I think here's what Plato would say, right? He'd say, no, Pericles, you're wrong. Democracies are terrible at making political decisions. The people make the decisions, but they are ignorant of the true nature of justice. And the politicians are just as bad They can persuade and manipulate the people, but they are also ignorant of the true nature of justice. The only people who know about justice are the philosophers, but they are completely ignored. So democracies will inevitably make bad and unjust decisions. So I think that's Plato's probably stance on the matter. How might Pericles respond? Well, I think he's got a few different lines of response, and I just want to kind of think about them very briefly before moving on to equality and freedom. So Pericles might say, well, look, Plato, it doesn't matter that the people aren't philosophers. Expert knowledge isn't required for making good political decisions, right? We can make good political decisions without being philosophers. How would Plato respond to this? Well, I think he'd say that it's ridiculous. You might have different views, of course, but I think he'd say it's ridiculous. I think he'd say something like this, right? Ruling well does require expertise, right? Think about modern politics. You must be expert in economics or political science in order to rule well, okay? So ruling well does require expertise. And we should also want our rulers to be moral experts, right? We should want our rulers to know about the just, the good, the right, for example, right? Otherwise, what kind of decisions are they making? So good rulers do need to be experts, and they do need to know the forms so that they're also expert in moral matters, for example, about justice and the good. Okay, how might Pericles respond in turn? Well, maybe he'd give up on that point. He'd say, well, fine, Plato, whatever, I accept that. But we should give everyone the chance to become a philosopher, right? If we give everyone the chance to become a philosopher, then everyone can take part in rule. And then we'd have a democracy again, right? But everyone would be trained for it. Wouldn't that be a better option? Well, how would Plato respond to this? Well, I think he's probably going to say two things. First of all, he's going to say, Pericles, that just won't work. Some people just aren't cut out to be philosophers. They don't have the right nature for it. So for Plato, being a philosopher is exceptionally demanding, and you've got to have the right kind of nature to be a philosopher. And not everyone has that on Plato's view. I think that's the first thing he'd say. I think the second thing he'd say is that it just doesn't seem very sensible, right? We don't want everyone in society to be experts in ruling, just as we don't want everyone to be expert doctors, expert tailors, or expert builders, right? It's better to have a division of labor. It's better to have some people who specialize in ruling on the one hand, and others who spend their lives specializing in other important disciplines, such as medicine, tailoring, building, so on and so forth, right? So it's just not even a very sensible idea to train everyone in philosophy. Okay, so how might Pericles respond in turn? Well, he might go, okay, I'll concede this point, Plato. Maybe democracies don't make the best decisions, but still, democracy does ensure that people are treated as political equals, and it ensures that people have the freedom to pursue whatever life they want. So Pericles might say, okay, I admit that democracies don't make the best decisions, but still, equality and freedom, these are the important things about democracy, and this is why we should choose democracy over other forms of government, including your ideal city, Plato. Now, of course, Plato is not so sure about these justifications either. And in the last kind of 10 minutes or so, I'm just going to go over what some of the things he thinks about the values of equality and freedom in democracy, and why he thinks they're not good justifications for democracy. Okay, so Plato talks about democracy and the values of equality and freedom in Book 8 of the Republic, where he describes in some detail a democratic city. Now, in the democratic city that Plato describes, everyone is given an equal share in ruling, assigning people to positions of rule by lot. And in the democratic city is full of freedom, for example, freedom of speech. And we're told that everyone has license to do what he wants, to arrange his own life in whatever manner pleases him. And also, as Plato describes it, democracies are liberal, tolerant, and diverse. So Plato actually agrees with Pericles, right? Democracies do have these qualities, right? They do have equality in rule, they do have lots of freedom, and they are liberal, tolerant, and diverse. Plato agrees about that. Now, of course, we and Pericles might think this all sounds great, right? These are good things about democracy. But Plato thinks that this all actually leads to some serious problems. So let's first think about the problem of equality in democracy on Plato's view. So Plato, I think, essentially believes that equality of political rule is just a mistake. As he says, democracy distributes a sort of equality to both equals and unequals alike. So what's the idea here? Well, I think the basic idea, right, is that democracy treats people as if they are equals when it comes to ruling well and badly. But people are not all equals in this respect. Some of us are better at ruling than others, right? The philosophers are better at ruling than everyone else because they've got the right knowledge for the job. So the basic thought is, look, equality in political rule is mistaken. We're not all equals in this respect on Plato's view. So I think Plato would say something like this. Okay, Pericles, you're right that everyone should be treated as equals before the law, but this isn't special to democracy, right? We can have equality before the law in the ideal city too. So he might agree with Pericles on one point, but he'll disagree with Pericles on another. He'd say, Pericles, you're wrong about equality in political rule, right? That's to say, in taking part in government, making decisions in the assembly, on the council, so on and so forth. He's going to say, look, everyone should not be treated as equals when it comes to making political decisions and political rule, because people aren't equals in that respect. In fact, some are better at it than others, and we should make sure we respect those differences and give the rule to the people who are better at it. So I think Plato would say, look, actually, Pericles, you say equality in political rule is a good thing about democracies, but it's not, right? Equality in political rule is not a value. It's actually a bad thing. It's a mistake that democracies make. So you can't say that democracy is good because it gives people equality in political rule, because that's just a mistake. People aren't equal in that respect. So I think that's how Plato might respond to the value of equality, right? How would he respond to the value of freedom? Well, this one's going to take a little bit of time to go over, but his basic worry is that democratic freedom leads to anarchy. So what I'm going to do is tell you briefly about why he thinks that, and then we'll think a little bit about whether he's right or not. So in the democratic city that Plato describes, he says, look, democracies value freedom above everything else. For example, the freedom to do what you want, the freedom to live whatever life you please. In democracies, the value of freedom, these freedoms, is valued above everything else. Now, Plato says, well, look, this leads to some strange consequences. If you value freedom above everything else, and everyone is strictly speaking free to do whatever they want, then it follows that if you're a citizen in a democracy, you don't have to take part in the assembly if you don't want to. You don't have to go to war if you don't want to. You don't have to obey the law if you don't want to. Convicted criminals can roam free if they want to. Well, why? Well, because in democracies, people are meant to be free to do what they want. So if they want to break the law, if they want not to go to war, if they want not to take part in politics, they don't have to, because democracies value freedom. And then Plato says, well, this gets even worse. He thinks that democratic cities eventually become drunk on freedom. It descends into anarchy. Politicians who restrict the people's freedom are hated. People who obey the laws are ridiculed. Authority figures are ignored, for example, parents and teachers. Animals and slaves are treated as free, and everyone is, as Plato writes, equally full of freedom. So on Plato's view, democratic freedoms lead to anarchy, and he even thinks that this anarchy will eventually lead to tyranny, to the setting up of a tyrant. So remember, Pericles says, hey, look, we should choose democracy because in democracies we have freedom. But Plato says, actually, this freedom isn't a good thing. Actually, it's pretty unappealing. Democratic freedom leads to anarchy, and anarchy eventually even leads to tyranny, right? So democratic freedom actually isn't such a good thing after all, on Plato's view. Now, you might be thinking, is this really a fair description of democracy, right? I'm sure you can think of a democracy that isn't anarchic or lawless in the way that we've just been talking about. And you might think of democratic Athens, right? So if you think about democratic Athens, in democratic Athens, I think it's probably true that people could get away with breaking the law, right? So for example, in Plato's Crito, we're told that Socrates could have bribed his jailers and fled Athens and avoided drinking hemlock if he wanted to, but he chose not to. He thought it was the right thing to do, not to bribe his jailers and flee. So people could break the law and get away with it in principle. But of course, lots of people did obey the law, right? Lots of people did attend the assembly, serve on the council. Lots of people did fight wars for Athens. Indeed, Socrates did all these things. Well, actually, he says he didn't attend the assembly, but he did at least serve on the council. We have some evidence of that. So even if rule of law wasn't perfectly maintained in democratic Athens, it certainly wasn't lawless anarchy, right? So it looks like Plato's description of democracy as a city that values freedom, which leads to anarchy, it looks like this description is just a bit unfair, because we can think of democracies that weren't lawless and weren't anarchic. So there seems to be a worry, a problem for Plato's claim. But at this point, I think we should think, well, look, Plato obviously knew this, right? He lived in democratic cities. So he knew that not all democratic cities are anarchic in this way. So maybe he's trying to make a more subtle point. What might that be? Well, here's an interpretation. It's an interpretation offered by a scholar called Malcolm Schofield in his book, Plato, Political Philosophy. You can see Malcolm Schofield and his book on the right of the screen. Schofield says that Plato thinks that democracy has a paradox. And here's how it's meant to go. A key democratic value is freedom to do whatever you want and live whatever life you please, right? We've seen Pericles talking about this value of democracy. So a key democratic value is the freedom to do whatever you want and live whatever life you please. But on the other hand, right, democracy will only work if people take part in ruling. For example, if they serve on the council as a juror, and democracy will only work if people defend the city, for example, in wars. And democracy only works if people respect the law and the constitution. So there's a tension in democracy, according to Plato. This is the paradox, right? If freedom is valued above everything else, then the people don't have to take part in ruling or defend the city or respect the laws if they don't want to. They're free not to if they don't want to. So the basic tensional paradox is that democracy values freedom and gives people the freedom to undermine democracy if they want to. And this is meant to be an inherent flaw of democracy. Why Plato thinks that democracy will inevitably lead to anarchy, because democracy gives people the freedom to undermine democracy itself. Okay, how might Pericles respond to this? Well, I think he might say something like this, right? He might just say, chill out, Plato, relax. We can trust the people, right? If you give them their freedom, they will still take part in government and they will still obey the laws, at least for the most part, and they will fight for Athens, right? So we can give people their freedom and it's not going to descend into anarchy. So democracy is a good thing. It gives people freedom and freedom does not descend into anarchy. How might Plato respond? And this will be the last bit. Well, I think on Plato's view is that Pericles is being overly optimistic here. Plato would say something like this. The people are fundamentally driven by their appetites, so they will inevitably take their freedom to the extreme, breaking the law, not fighting for the city, and abandoning government in favor of doing whatever they can to satisfy their appetites and live free. Think back to the image of the people as the wild beast, right, driven by its appetites. We get the impression that the people in a democracy are meant to be like that. So we have a really pessimistic view of human nature here, and clearly a pessimistic view of people in democracy. In democracy, the people are driven by their appetites, and if people are given the freedom to do whatever they want in a democracy, then on Plato's view, anarchy will ensue. Okay, so something by way of summary. Our question we started with was, why choose democracy over other forms of government? And we thought of 3 reasons to choose democracy given by Pericles. First of all, democracies make the best decisions. Second of all, democracies ensure equality. And third of all, democracies ensure freedom. And Plato's responded to each of them, right? We had a bit of a back and forth. The questions are still open, but Plato has given some reasons to doubt each of these 3 justifications. First of all, he thinks democracies don't make the best decisions, right? Because people are ignorant. You need expert philosophical knowledge to make the best decisions. For that, we need the ideal city, which is not democratic. Second of all, he thinks equality is misplaced. People shouldn't be given equality in political rule because people aren't equals, right? Philosophers are better than others at making political decisions. And third and finally, Plato thinks that freedom in democracy is a problem. The freedom that democracies celebrate will eventually lead to lawlessness, anarchy, the downfall of democracy itself, and the rise of tyranny. So I think Plato's idea in a nutshell here can be put like this, right? I think Plato's basically saying, look, in democracies, the kind of things we value are equality, freedom, and deliberation. These are kind of liberal democratic values. And Plato thinks that you can't have justice in a democratic city. And he's basically saying, look, if you really care about justice, and justice is something you should care about, then you must instead choose my ideal city where philosophers rule and make just laws, just policies, so on and so forth. So he's saying, give up our liberal democratic values in favor of the value of justice in the ideal city instead.